I'm Lauren Whitmore, 36 years old, and I hadn't seen my father's face in 3 years when I walked into the funeral chapel. My sister caught sight of me. First, she leaned into the woman next to her and smiled. Not kindly. The room was full of people I used to call family, but no one stood. No one said my name. They'd left me out of the obituary, the program, and the photo board just like they'd left me out of the will, or so they thought. Before I go any further, let me know where you're listening from in the comments and hit that like and subscribe button if you've ever felt invisible in a room full of people who once knew your name. My name used to mean something in this family. I was raised to believe hard work mattered, that the truth held weight, and that if you treated people with kindness, it would come back to you. My father, Daniel Whitmore, built his company from the ground up, and for most of my childhood, he carried the air of a man who knew exactly who he was. He kept things simple: Sunday dinners, clean shoes, firm handshakes. We didn't grow up rich. My mom worked part-time at the elementary school, and I shared a room with my sister Caroline until we were both teenagers. But there was pride in what we had. We didn't miss meals, and when Dad got the business off the ground, he made sure we all understood where it came from. "Don't take shortcuts," he'd say. "Not in this house." I believed that. I really did. I was always the quiet one, the rule follower. Caroline was the bright star, sharp-tongued, confident, always a step ahead of everyone in the room. Dad admired that in her. He said she had presence. By the time I was in my 20s, I was handling back-end systems for the company, payroll taxes, licensing. I wasn't flashy, but I was steady. It felt like enough until the day I found something that didn't add up. A few financial documents misfiled, a second account I hadn't seen before, then more transfers, reclassifications, and my name tied to all of it. At first I thought it was a mistake. I brought it to Dad gently, respectfully. I asked if maybe something had been mixed up. I can still see his face, the way he set his coffee mug down without looking at me. "Don't ask questions you don't want the answers to," he said. I did ask, and within a week I was gone. Caroline was the one who spread the story. She said I'd had a breakdown, that I'd been struggling for years ever since college. She told the family I was being dramatic paranoid, that I'd always resented her success. None of them asked me what happened. I left town with 2 suitcases and a job that let me keep my head down. For 3 years, I kept quiet. Not because I didn't have something to say, but because I knew no one would listen. And now, standing in that funeral chapel, I watched Caroline straighten her skirt and smile at the people in the front pews, like she owned the place. My mother stood beside her, stiff and silent. No one had told me when Dad died. I found out from a neighbor 2 towns over. Still I came, and when the lawyer rose from the corner of the room holding a folded sheet of paper, I felt the weight of every eye turn toward me. He cleared his throat, looked right at me, and said my name. The lawyer's voice was steady when he said my name, Lauren Whitmore, and for a second it felt like the whole chapel shifted. Caroline stiffened in her seat. My mother's jaw locked, but she didn't turn her head. I sat still in the back row, hands folded in my lap, the only sound the quiet hum of the ceiling vent and a faint sniffle from somewhere near the front. Then the lawyer unfolded a letter, one written by my father, and began to read. "To my daughter Lauren, if she dares show her face." There was a quiet intake of breath across the room. The words fell hard, not whispered, not veiled, just out there, plain and deliberate. I didn't flinch, but I felt the sting bloom hot across my chest. I looked straight ahead, not at Caroline, not at anyone else, just at the casket up front beneath that soft morning light, and waited. The letter continued sentence after sentence, painting a version of me that no one had asked me to confirm. It said I'd abandoned the family at a crucial time, that when the business came under investigation, I ran instead of standing by him, that I left him and Caroline to carry the burden of scrutiny alone. The lawyer read every word slowly, like he'd been told to let them land. Around me I could hear murmurs, some subtle, some not. A cousin's voice, just loud enough she did disappear. Another whisper closer to my shoulder. I heard she had a breakdown. I sat still, eyes forward. My nails pressed into my palms so hard I could feel the pulse in them. But the part that stayed with me wasn't the accusations. It was the way Caroline turned in her seat when the letter ended. Not a full turn, just enough for me to see the edge of her mouth pull into a smirk. She didn't say a word. She didn't have to. Everyone in that room had heard her version of me for years. This letter just sealed it. I remembered exactly how it started, how fast it all moved once I found the documents. I was 33, managing financial compliance for Whitmore Industries, the family business. I'd been reconciling some quarterly figures when I came across discrepancies, modest at first, then stranger the deeper I looked. Funds shifted through secondary accounts I didn't recognize. Some linked directly to my employee ID, my Social Security number. At first, I thought it was a systems error. I printed the reports, circled the numbers, and brought them to my father's office the next morning. He was sitting at his desk, sun through the window behind him, tie loosened. I laid the papers down and explained what I'd found. My voice didn't shake. I was careful with my words. But he didn't look at the papers. He didn't even pretend to be surprised. "You don't understand how things work," he said. "It's already been handled." I said I couldn't sign off on anything. I said if this ever got audited, it could fall on me. That's when his expression changed. He leaned back, folded his arms, and said one sentence that still echoes when I remember it. "Then you'll need to make a choice, Lauren. Either you're with us or you're not." That night I came home to find my key didn't work. Caroline opened the door. She didn't ask me anything, just stepped aside and nodded toward the porch. My things were already packed, 2 suitcases, a folder with my final paycheck, and a sealed envelope marked HR release. Mom didn't say goodbye. She stood by the hallway, arms crossed, eyes dry. When I asked her why she didn't even ask me what happened, she said, "He's trying to protect the family. You need help." That was the phrase they used. Help, like I was sick. Delusional. Caroline told the others I'd had trouble in college, that I'd seen a therapist after a breakup. She told them I'd always had a hard time coping, that this was just another episode. The next week, my employer received an anonymous tip tying my name to the IRS inquiry. My contract was terminated. No reason given, just a signature and a severance check that barely covered my rent. So I left. I found a job 2 towns over then, another after that. I kept my head down, stayed off social media, and told people I didn't talk to my family much. It was easier than explaining the rest. Now sitting there in the back row of the funeral chapel, listening to my father accuse me from the grave, I thought about those nights I couldn't sleep when I stared at the ceiling, wondering if silence was the right choice, if maybe speaking up had done more harm than good, if I should have just stayed quiet and signed the forms like he asked. But then I remembered the pen. It was gone. The mahogany pen he always kept for official documents, engraved gold tip set out beside the guest book, and memorial photo. It had been on that little velvet-lined table when I walked in. Now it wasn't. Something about that detail sat wrong in my mind, like a puzzle piece I hadn't realized was missing until it was gone. The lawyer folded the letter and stepped back. A few people in the front row glanced my way, waiting for a reaction. I gave them none. Caroline stood and walked toward the podium, eulogy in hand. As she passed me, she leaned close and whispered, "Try not to make a scene. This isn't about you." I didn't respond, because I knew something she didn't. That letter with all its accusations wasn't the end of the reading. It was only the beginning. The service ended just after 11. A few cousins moved toward the lobby, whispering in small clusters, their eyes glancing back at me as they passed. I stayed seated still in the back row until the last notes from the organ faded. The air inside the chapel had grown heavier somehow, like all that judgment had settled into the carpet. I stood slowly and stepped into the hallway. The tile was cold under my shoes. A framed photograph of my father in his office years ago hung just outside the chapel doors, dust on the corners of the glass. His tie slightly crooked, his mouth almost smiling. Farther down the hall, I passed the refreshments table untouched. Water in glass pitchers, small plates of cookies no one had eaten. I wasn't hungry. I just needed quiet. I found a small bench near the coat room, tucked away beside a table of memorial pamphlets. The seat creaked when I sat down, and I leaned forward, elbows resting on my knees. My phone buzzed once inside my coat, but I didn't reach for it. Outside the window, the parking lot shimmered in the early light. A few cars were already gone. The voice that interrupted the silence was quiet but certain. "Miss Whitmore." I turned. A man stood a few feet away, suit-neat glasses low on his nose, holding something in his hands. He looked familiar, but I couldn't place him. "I'm Tom Barrett," he said. "Your father's attorney." "Well, former attorney, technically." I nodded. He paused, then continued. "He asked me to hold something, just in case you came." He handed me a small envelope, handwritten, my name across the front in pen. The paper was worn around the edges. I didn't open it right away. I just held it for a moment. Tom gave a gentle nod and stepped back. I waited until he was gone before I slid my finger beneath the flap and unfolded the page. Lauren. If you're reading this, I guess I didn't find the words in time. The handwriting was familiar, slanted to the right loops, clean but shaky in places. "I know I failed you. You told the truth and I didn't want to hear it. I let someone else turn me against you. I believed what was easier to believe, and I let you carry the blame." My hands didn't tremble. Not exactly, but the letter was damp in the corners when I folded it again and placed it in the inside pocket of my coat. I stepped outside just for a moment. The air was cool, a little damp from overnight rain. I stood near the hedges, close enough to still hear the muffled voices inside, but far enough that no one would follow. 3 years. That's how long it had been since I'd spoken to him, since the day outside the hospital. I had driven straight there after hearing from a friend who worked the night shift. He was being monitored for chest pain. When I got to the hallway outside his room, Caroline was already there, hair done heels, sharp visitor list in hand. "He doesn't want to see you," she said. "He told me to make sure." I nodded, turned around and left. I didn't try again. Back inside the chapel, most of the crowd had cleared. Caroline stood near the front, arms crossed, speaking quietly to 2 aunts and a cousin I hadn't seen since high school. Her voice carried a little measured clipped. She pressured him. "You all know it." He wasn't thinking clearly at the end. I stepped forward slowly. I didn't stop at the pews. I didn't raise my voice. I just walked to the small table at the front, the one that had held the pen, and placed my father's letter down beside the guest book. "She didn't pressure him," I said. "These are his words, in his handwriting." The room went still. One of the aunts picked up the page, scanned the signature at the bottom. She didn't say anything at first, just looked up and nodded once. "That's him." Caroline didn't speak. Her mouth was tight, but she didn't reach for the letter. I didn't stay long after that. I didn't need to. I walked out without looking back, my shoes soft on the carpeted floor, the letter still folded in my pocket close enough to feel its weight as I moved. At home, the apartment felt smaller than usual. The silence was a different kind. Not judgment, just quiet. I stood near the window watching the light shift behind the clouds. My phone buzzed again. A new message. It was from the trust administrator's office. Subject filing initiated. Transfer of controlling interest. Whitmore Private Trust. I read it 3 times, not because I didn't understand, just because I needed to be sure. He hadn't removed me, not officially. The clause still stood. My name was still on record. By the next morning, I was on the 18th floor of the office tower in downtown Denver, seated across from a man in a gray suit named Richard Langley. His folder sat open on the table between us. The walls were glass. The light was soft and gray. The clause was never revoked, he explained. There was a draft amendment removing you, but it was never signed or filed. Legally, you're still a fiduciary. He slid something across the table. A flash drive. Inside a clear plastic bag. This was found in your father's private drawer. Locked. Labeled for you. I took it home, plugged it in, opened the audio file. His voice came through faint but unmistakable. You were my daughter first. I forgot that. I let others twist it. I stood still in the middle of the living room, the file playing through the speakers. He spoke of a video Caroline had edited, of things he hadn't said, of things he had. When the audio ended, I sat down at the kitchen table and stared at the small black drive in my hand. I didn't know what I was supposed to do with it. Not yet. But I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't leaving again. It was after midnight when I opened the last box in the hallway closet. The one labeled, Misk, Dad. I hadn't touched it since moving into the apartment. Inside were a few old receipts, a leather planner, and a cracked photo album with curling pages. At the very bottom, wrapped in a dish towel, was something heavier than the rest. I unwrapped it slowly and held it in both hands. The vase. The same one Caroline had thrown all those years ago, junior year of college. Cracked in 3 places, the glaze dulled but still intact. Someone had taped it back together sloppily. The dried adhesive was yellowed and peeling at the corners. Tucked inside the vase was a folded note. The handwriting was unmistakable. Silence helped once, but not always. I sat on the floor next to the open box, the note resting in my palm. The memory came back in pieces. The envelope from the university had arrived that afternoon. Full scholarship. Every credit covered. I remember holding it tight in my hand, heart pounding, walking into the living room where Mom was folding laundry, and Caroline was lounging on the arm of Dad's recliner. I got it, I'd said barely above a whisper. The biotech fellowship. Caroline's head snapped up. She stood slowly, not saying a word at first. Then just before the crash, I remember her voice quiet, flat. You always have to make everything about you. The vase flew past my shoulder and hit the far wall. Water soaked into the carpet. Shards scattered across the floor. I stood there frozen. Mom pulled Caroline back, but not with anger, just urgency. Don't provoke her, she said, looking at me. You know how she gets. That night, I packed in silence. Left the next morning before sunrise with a bruise on my arm and the letter still folded in my backpack. Now, years later, the same vase sat on the living room floor, taped together, holding the same sharp truth I had ignored for too long. I looked at the note again. I hadn't expected him to remember that night, but he had. I sat for a long time without moving, not angry, not hurt, just tired in a way that didn't have a name. By morning, I still hadn't made a decision. I had rights now legal standing, the trust, the clause. I could step forward or let it go. Let Caroline keep what she'd worked so hard to control. Let the story stay the way she'd told it. I had lived without any of it for 3 years. What difference would it make? I stood up slowly, knees stiff from sitting too long, and placed the vase on the kitchen counter. I didn't know what I was going to do with it yet, but I wasn't throwing it away. Later that afternoon, I received a message. It was short, just 1 sentence. You told me to speak up even when my voice shook. You okay? It was from Leah, a girl I'd mentored back when I still had my footing back when the outreach program was still mine to run. She'd been 14 at the time, bright, quiet, unsure. I'd spent a year walking her through science fairs and public speaking prep. She hadn't needed much, just someone steady. I read the message twice, then again. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. I didn't plan what I was going to write. I just typed. I'm about to speak. Friday morning came with low clouds and a steady hum in the back of my head. I took the elevator up to the 27th floor, hands deep in my coat pockets. I didn't bring anything with me except a folder and the nameplate I'd found wrapped in an old towel, the one Grandpa had carved when I got my first office. The boardroom doors opened without resistance. Inside, the table was full, polished wood, familiar faces, and one empty seat left across from Caroline. I walked in without slowing and took the chair across from hers. "Morning," I said to the room. Caroline's hand froze mid-tap on the tabletop. She sat up straighter, adjusted her jacket, and opened a folder. "I'd like to begin with a clarification," she said, placing a document in the center of the table. "This is a signed resignation letter from Lauren Whitmore dated 3 years ago, relinquishing all operational and fiduciary responsibility." She passed it to the chair. I didn't reach for it. I didn't even look down. "Interesting. You didn't think I'd come," I said. "You signed this." "Are you denying it?" she asked, voice tight. "I'm saying," I replied, "let's watch the clip." I reached into my bag and placed a flash drive on the table, slid it toward the AV port. The room was still. "HR has already reviewed it," I said. "I asked for approval to show it this morning." The screen on the far wall flickered to life. The footage came from the admin office's internal system, dated 1 week prior. Caroline and her assistant stood at the printer. She laughed. She tapped something on the screen. The resignation letter printed. She held it up, signed the bottom, and said clearly, "Her signature's easy. I used to sign her permission slips." Silence followed. The board chair leaned forward. One man sighed. Another rubbed the bridge of his nose. Caroline didn't speak at first. Then she tried. It was a joke. "We didn't submit it. It's in the internal archive," I said, "with metadata, time-stamped. Uploaded under my name." I looked around the table. Calm, not angry, not afraid. "I'm not asking for sympathy," I said. "I'm invoking Clause 433, a vote to initiate financial and procedural audit in the event of coercion or fraudulent removal of a founding member." The board chair opened the document, scanned it, and looked around. "Motion is valid. We'll vote now." Hands were raised. 7 out of 9. The motion passed. I stood, collected my folder, and placed the carved nameplate on the table in front of my seat. Then I nodded once and walked out without looking back. The hallway was quiet. My steps were steady. I didn't rush. I didn't feel triumphant. I just felt certain. The boardroom had been cleared for audit compliance by the following Saturday. The door was locked and the blinds had been drawn halfway. From the outside, it looked quiet, uneventful. But inside, something had shifted. You could feel it in the way people walked the hall slower than usual, in how voices dropped a little lower when they passed my name in conversation. I arrived early. Too early, maybe. The place still smelled faintly of copier toner and citrus cleaner. I took the same seat I had 2 days earlier, set my bag on the chair beside me, and placed the nameplate on the table once again. The grain in the wood caught the light as I centered it. A junior legal associate came in first, then someone from compliance. By 10:30, the room had filled. The audit team, the firm's general counsel, a few assistants. Most of them avoided eye contact. I didn't take it personally. I knew what they'd heard, what the press had printed. A media release had gone out late the night before. It didn't name me directly, but the language was clear enough. Phoenix Bioworks was reviewing potential financial discrepancies involving a former executive. An anonymous tip had triggered the inquiry. No formal charges, just speculation. That's all it took. I read the statement once sitting at my kitchen table in the dark. I didn't reply. I didn't call anyone. But I knew where it had come from. I'd seen Caroline play this game before, just never from this side of the board. Now, seated at the conference table, I waited until they asked if I had anything I wanted to share before they proceeded. Yes, I said. I'd like to submit additional documentation. I slid a small stack of printed emails across the table, followed by a labeled USB drive. The lead auditor opened the folder. A few others leaned in as he clicked open the first file on screen. It was an email exchange between Caroline and an outside attorney. The subject line was dated 2 months earlier. Contingency plan if she returns. The messages were clear. The goal wasn't defense, it was preemptive control. They discussed media angles, drafted statements, outlined strategy. One message ended with a single line. She won't fight. She never does. No one spoke for a while. The general counsel leaned back in his chair, scanning the text slowly. One of the senior board members rubbed his forehead, then dropped his hand. "These are authentic," someone finally asked. "They're from an encrypted folder recovered from my father's private drive," I said. "They've been verified by the forensic team." The room stayed still. "Would you like to file a formal complaint?" the counsel asked. "Defamation, breach of fiduciary duty, potential fraud." "No," I said. "I'm not asking for anything to be taken from her. I just want it stopped. No more stories. No more rewrites." He gave a single nod and turned toward the legal assistant seated beside him. "Noted for the record." I pulled my phone from my coat pocket and typed a short message. A statement. No edits. No flourishes. I'm not here for revenge. Just truth. Let the record show what was done. I won't bury anyone, but I won't be buried either. I sent it before I could overthink it. One of the interns stepped forward with a glass of water, set it beside me without saying much. As she turned to leave, she paused just long enough to speak quietly. "We've been rooting for you," she said. "Some of us don't have last names that open doors." I nodded once. That was all I could do in the moment. Outside, cameras had started to gather. The press hadn't left. The story had grown legs, and people were watching now, even if they didn't know the whole picture. That part didn't matter anymore. A week passed quietly, not with fanfare, not with celebration. The news cycles moved on as they always do. Caroline's name was quietly removed from the board directory. Her LinkedIn profile listed a sabbatical. No formal statement, just absence. One morning, I found myself back in my grandfather's study. The windows were cracked. The breeze was light touched with pine. I sat at the desk, the nameplate steady in the center. It didn't feel like a symbol anymore. It felt like a beginning. I opened an old folder. Not a business file, just something I'd kept in storage. Letters, notes, drawings from the girls I used to mentor. Years ago, I'd started an online resource, quietseed.org. It had been small, just a side project. I'd let it fade when everything else fell apart, but the domain still worked. The structure was there. I sent a few messages to women I remembered, ones who'd shared their ideas, their worries, their plans that hadn't gotten off the ground. We didn't call it anything official. We just started meeting. 5 of us at first, then more. No funding pitches, no speeches, just stories. One afternoon, a girl no older than 20 sat across from me in the old study chair. She looked around the room, then said, "You don't say much, but when you do, it feels like it matters." I didn't have a response for that. I just nodded and smiled. That was enough. The phone stayed quiet for the most part. Caroline didn't reach out. Neither did my mother. She had left town after the funeral. One message, no apology, no explanation. Just a short sentence. "You got what you wanted. Let it rest." I didn't reply. The rest of the files could wait. There would be more paperwork, more meetings. But for now, there was the desk, the breeze, and a vase on the windowsill, the one I had repaired myself just enough to keep it standing. I wasn't done. Not yet. The following Friday started quiet. I arrived early again, same elevator, same hallway, same steady pace. But as soon as I stepped into the boardroom, I could feel it. Something had shifted. The blinds were drawn, the lights dimmed lower than usual, and there was a hum of urgency in the air. One of the legal aides handed me a printed PDF without a word. It was a media release, time-stamped just before midnight the night before. Phoenix Bioworks confirms an internal investigation involving a former executive. Allegations include potential financial misconduct during fiscal years 2021 and 2022. The matter was brought forward through an anonymous tip. No name was listed, but it didn't need one. I was the only former executive anyone had been talking about. I stood in the hallway and reread the statement. My phone buzzed again, this time with Slack notifications. I opened the app and saw the threads, employees tagging each other, whispering guesses. Some cautious, others quick to assume, a few too familiar. Didn't she leave kind of suddenly back then? Maybe Callista was cleaning up after her all along. No one had called me. No one asked for my side. I closed the app and slid my phone back into my pocket. The weight of it felt different now. Not heavy exactly, just cold. One of the board attorneys waved me into the smaller legal conference room next door. We were meeting separately that day, strictly with the internal legal team and the outside auditors. I nodded, walked in, and sat down at the far end of the table. As people settled into their seats, someone from legal asked if I had any opening remarks before they proceeded. "I do," I said, "and I've brought documentation to support them." I reached into my bag and pulled out a binder, printed emails, signed memos, and a second flash drive, all cataloged, organized, and already reviewed by the forensics team. The lead auditor opened the first file. It was another thread of messages between Caroline and her outside counsel. This one dated 3 weeks ago. Subject line, "If she escalates." They had drafted statements in advance, plotted how to word things carefully to trigger doubt but avoid legal exposure. The language was cold, clean. There was even a working draft of the press release that had gone out the night before, same structure, same phrasing. At the bottom of the last email, one sentence stood out. "She won't fight. She never does." The general counsel stared at the page for a long moment before speaking. "These were recovered from your father's drive." "Yes," I said. "Private encrypted time-stamped." He labeled the folder with my name. The forensic analyst confirmed the data chain, verified the source. I didn't need to say anything else. The room stayed quiet for a long stretch. A few people scribbled notes. Someone clicked a pen open and shut 3 times. Finally, the head of legal turned to me again. "Would you like to pursue a countersuit, defamation, breach of duty, possibly obstruction?" "No," I said. "I'm not interested in taking anything from her. I just want the lies to stop." He nodded slowly. "Then we'll enter it into the record." I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out my phone. I typed out one short message. Statement from Lauren Whitmore. "I have no interest in revenge, only truth. Let the record reflect what was done. I'm not here to bury anyone, but I won't let anyone bury me either." I sent it. That was all. One of the interns brought me a glass of water and set it beside me. She didn't say anything at first, just turned to leave. But then she stopped, looked down and said, "We saw what they wrote. Some of us know how it works. We've been rooting for you." I looked up. She didn't hold the moment for long. She just nodded once and walked away. That afternoon, I returned to the old study and opened the windows wide. The air felt cooler than usual, carrying the faintest scent of pine. I stood near the desk looking out at the backyard where the garden used to be. I had no plans that evening. No meetings, no emails to send, just space. I reached for the carved nameplate and turned it in my hands. It was smooth along the edges, dark with age. I set it back down at the center of the desk. It belonged there. There were no calls from Caroline, no messages. Her silence didn't bother me, not anymore. Later that night, I opened a box of files my grandfather had kept in storage. Nothing urgent, just records, notes, receipts from decades ago. I wasn't looking for anything, just sorting. Behind the bottom panel of the built-in bookshelf, something shifted. I reached behind it and found a yellowed envelope. The handwriting was his. Lauren, if you're reading this, you stayed. That's why I left it all to you. I sat down slowly. Read the letter all the way through. They all thought being loud made you strong, but I saw something else. You didn't yell. You didn't fight to be seen. You just watched. You endured. That's a kind of strength people overlook. And I'm sorry I didn't say it sooner. The family broke itself trying to silence you. I hope you build something better. I folded the letter neatly and tucked it into the bottom drawer of the desk. I didn't cry. Not then. But the quiet felt different after that. The next day I found an old chair out by the shed. One of the legs was loose, the wood chipped. I brought it into the garage and started sanding it down. A boy from next door, maybe 10, maybe younger, rode his bike in circles around the driveway. He stopped when he saw me working. You building something, he asked. Fixing something, I said. Can I help? I nodded. He held the frame steady while I reattached the slat. I let him tighten the last screw. When we finished, he ran his hand along the wood. It yours? He asked. No, I said, but it's ready for someone who needs it. By Monday morning, Phoenix Bioworks had quietly updated its board listings. Caroline's name was no longer there. No press release, no announcement, just a revised directory and a line in the staff email that read, "Leadership transition effective immediately." I read it once, then closed the screen. The legal team finished their internal summary 2 days later. The audit confirmed everything I'd submitted. No wrongdoing on my end. Every document traced back to the folder my father had secured before he passed. The paper trail told its own story, quiet and unshakable. I didn't gloat. I didn't send out a message or gather anyone around. I just showed up early the next morning, let myself into the office, and unlocked the door to the smaller side conference room where I used to keep my files. I placed my carved nameplate at the center of the table. It had been wrapped in flannel for so long I'd forgotten how solid it felt. The edges were worn smooth. The grain caught the light when the sun came through the blinds. That afternoon, I opened the old laptop I used to keep in the field. Buried in one of the folders was a draft of the original bylaws. I printed a clean copy, highlighted Clause 7.2, and filed it under the new structure. No fanfare, just maintenance. There were a few awkward nods in the hallway that week, people I used to work with, some I didn't know well. Most didn't say much. One or two offered a quiet, "Good to have you back," but mostly people kept moving. Caroline never contacted me, not directly. The last communication I received was a legal withdrawal form submitted by her outside counsel. She wasn't contesting anything. Her LinkedIn now listed consultant. Her personal website had been taken offline. My mother didn't call either. She'd left town after the funeral. A single text arrived one evening while I was boiling pasta. It said, "You got what you wanted. Let it rest." I didn't answer. That same night, I walked through the house and opened a few old storage bins. I wasn't sure what I was looking for. I passed the repaired chair sitting under the window, paused beside it for a moment, then kept going. In the corner of the closet was a cardboard box marked QS Archives. Quiet seed. I hadn't touched it in years. Inside were notes from early mentorship calls, sketches for the website, sticky notes scribbled with plans. I thumbed through one loose sheet and saw a familiar name, Leah. She'd written me a note once after her first public speaking event. "Thank you for helping me say what I couldn't." I plugged in the old desktop computer I used back then. It took time to boot, but the files were still there. I reopened the original domain, changed the expired registration, and sent out a short message to the women I still had contact information for. "We're restarting. No ads, no fees, just time and space." We started with 3, then 5, then a few more. We met on Tuesday nights in the old study. No agenda, no pressure. One woman brought tea, another brought a notebook full of startup ideas. They didn't want to be told what to do, they just wanted to be heard. I didn't speak often. I didn't need to. One girl barely out of high school watched me during one of the sessions. After everyone else had left, she lingered near the bookshelf. "You always look like you're thinking 10 steps ahead," she said. "But you don't say much." I smiled. "When you do," she added, "it sticks." I didn't try to explain why. I just nodded. Sometimes a nod says enough. The press had moved on. The cameras were gone. Phoenix continued its operations under the revised charter, and new hires filled the gaps. I didn't try to lead. I didn't sit at the head of any table. But my name was back where it belonged, in ink on record, in the company filings and patent credits and legal trust documents. That was enough. I found myself back in my grandfather's study more often in the mornings. The carved nameplate remained steady on the desk, its weight more grounding than symbolic now. The letter he left me stayed tucked in the top drawer. I didn't read it every day, but I knew it was there. Some words don't need repeating to be remembered. No one apologized. Not really. But I stopped waiting for it. I'd rebuilt the chair, reopened the domain, stepped back into the company without forcing my way in. Nothing about it had been fast, but it had been mine. Each step, quiet and firm. By the time the final paperwork came through transferring full voting rights to me as successor trustee, there was nothing left to prove. The final signature was just that. Final. I signed it, closed the folder, and set it aside. The first time I sat in that chair again alone, I didn't say anything. I just rested my hands on the arms, let my shoulders fall, and breathed. Outside, the wind shifted the trees, casting long shadows across the floor. The house was quiet. No more voices echoing down the hallway. No one waiting with papers or questions or expectations. Just the hum of the furnace and the sound of wood settling as the temperature dropped. I wasn't trying to take up space. I'd spent years being careful not to. But something had changed. The silence wasn't heavy anymore. It was still. I kept the letter my grandfather left me in that top drawer. I didn't reread it often, but I knew every word. What he gave me wasn't just permission, it was recognition. Proof that someone had seen the truth and written it down in ink before it could be buried. The company went on. It didn't need me to be loud. I didn't chase headlines or position myself at the center. But when the younger hires reached out asking for time or guidance or just someone to listen, I always made space. We'd meet in the side conference room, the same one I once worked out of, and I'd let them speak. I didn't interrupt. I didn't rush them. Most just needed to hear their own voices in a room where no one was judging them. That's what Quiet Seed became again. Not a business, not a brand, just a space. A place to start something new or remember who you were before the noise. One woman came every Tuesday for months and never said a word. Then one evening she stayed behind and whispered, "I think I'm ready now." That was all. But it was enough. Caroline never reached out. My mother sent a card in spring. No return address, no message inside, just a single pressed daffodil. I didn't try to read into it. Some things don't need interpreting, they just need to be accepted. I never looked back at the obituary or the will. Those pages had been written by people trying to write me out. But the story didn't end where they wanted it to. And in the end, It wasn't about who got the biggest share or who stood at the front of the chapel. It was about who could stand quietly when no one was watching and still choose to do what was right. I didn't win by fighting louder. I didn't need revenge. I needed a voice, and I found it. Not by forcing anyone to listen, but by refusing to silence myself any longer. There's a kind of strength in sitting still, in not needing to prove anything, in showing up anyway. And sometimes the greatest justice isn't in what you take back, but in what you quietly rebuild in your own time on your own terms. Thanks for staying with me through this. If any part of it echoed something in your own life, I'd love to hear about it in the comments. And if this story meant something to you, go ahead and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. We all deserve to be heard, even in the quiet.